Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you. So, this will be the last lecture for our first week, and we're going to wrap up this period looking at exploration and conquest. Once again, not going to get into all the nitty-gritty details, okay? What we're looking at is looking at the conceptualized ideas of freedom. And so in this particular lecture, I'm going to be um, looking at the consequences of what has happened during this period, in particular, the fact that knowledge is no longer confined to one authority, that there is more of an openness in terms of being able to explore. People have the ability to question certain truths and doctrines because of the methodologies that are developing, the process in terms of objectivity, being able to come to conclusions that are based on methodologies of proofs and not just simply conjecture based in some sort of faith doctrine. And so we are going to be looking at the consequences of people and the conquests that happened as a result of new conceptualizations of travel as well as the technology that comes with it. Okay, so let's get right into it. So we're going to be looking at the motivations for European exploration. We're going to be looking at some of the consequences in terms of the clashes of cultures. We're going to be looking at the larger ideas specifically. And then we're also going to be looking at particularly the Spanish impact on the Americas because this particular European group has some of the earliest influences and impact on the continents. Okay, so let's get into it. Now, to give you just a brief picture, um, the Americas in 1491, before the arrival of Western Europeans. To be clear, we already have evidence that um, other people had made it to the Americas prior to Western Europeans. So Western Europeans during the 15th century, excuse me. So we know for a fact that Vikings, probably somewhere around the 8th, 9th century, had made it to parts of present day Canada, Nova Scotia. We know that they certainly made it to Iceland and Greenland. But we know this from two basic pieces of evidence. The first is that um, the Viking people did leave marks in terms of physical habitations in the areas of Nova Scotia, North America region. The other is that we actually have genetic evidence. When Western Europeans arrived in the 16th century into this area, they found Native Americans with red hair. Okay, so red hair only exists in certain recessive alleles, namely in areas of Ireland, Sweden, areas of Scandinavia, Norway. Okay. So, to find this is that we clearly know, and having some sort of genetic record. The one thing that you should always know is that when people meet each other, the one thing they're always going to have is intercourse. Okay. That's one thing that cannot be stopped. Remember that idea that there's always an exchange. Well, there's an exchange of ideas, there's an exchange of food, there's an exchange of goods and tools, ideas, and there's also an exchange of fluids, to put it crudely. Okay. So we know that there were Vikings certainly in this area. We also have theories that both individuals, possibly from as far as China as well as from the west coast of Africa, may have also made it onto certain parts of Mexico, on the western half of Mexico, as well as in some of the islands that were landed or quote unquote discovered by Columbus in particular, as well as other Western Europeans. And the evidence that we have from this is that we have um, not only anchors that were discovered off of the coast of Mexico that certainly resemble the type of anchors that were characteristic of the Ming Dynasty in China, but we also have metal arrow tips and spears that were discovered in when Columbus lands, he notices that the tools and especially the spear tips of the native peoples of this area, um, these individuals, he was like, well, there's no smelting process. They don't have any access to iron ore. So where exactly did they get it? And so the theory is that some people, possibly from West Africa, had made it all the way to that region, and so it's not impossible. We certainly know that the traveling vessels, the boats that West Africans had, especially the Phoenicians, in the earlier part of, we're talking, we're talking about 1,000 years before the time of Christ, that had boats that were simply strong enough to be able to cross the ocean, especially if they were able to use the monsoon and climate currents that would carry you that way. So it is certainly possible. And so, I say that, when we think of the word discovery, we often think that, oh, this was completely untouched and unheard of. I don't think that the term isolation is one that you could really ascribe to any region on our earth. People move, people travel, people, are always interested on what's the other side, right? Now, whether or not they are stopped or prevented because of physical barriers such as mountains or oceans, or, stopped because, of weather, or they're stopped because, they're the resources of the kingdom, they just can't get that far away from it to be able to survive. There's lots of different reasons to think about that. But we certainly know that when Columbus arrives in 1492, that the Americas at that time are an extremely populated area. Okay, the estimates are somewhere between 60 million and 100 million people. Some of the most populous regions, are located in present day Peru with the Inca civilization. We also have the Mexica, otherwise also referred to as the Aztec civilization in the Yucatan and central present day Mexico, as well as the Mississippians in the current southeastern region of the United States. So we have huge populations. These are populations that are located in major cities. If you take like Teotihuacan, the Aztec or the Mexican um, capital, which had somewhere in the range of maybe 200,000 to 300,000 inhabitants in the region, and probably maybe about 100,000 people located in the actual city. That made it the largest populated city on Earth at the time. And there wouldn't be it was rivaling close to the cities of Rome at the time. When Columbus arrives. And all of these regions, all of these people, we're talking about empires that are governed in a highly sophisticated, highly organized society. You cannot have a society of several hundred thousand people if you don't have a system of government, if you don't have a system of economics to feed all of these people. And you're also talking about a highly specialized and highly organized society where you have a ruler, you have a system of bureaucracy, you have a system of a military, you have a system of production, right? So, when you think about the narratives that are often spun about this region, this idea of a pristine wilderness, or somehow an empty land, that is just completely and utterly inaccurate. We have the evidence, not just in terms of the physical remnants of these societies, but we also have the documentation from the Europeans when they arrived. That the descriptions of by Cortez, when he comes upon Teotihuacan, his descriptions, the descriptions of the people traveling with him, are ones of just complete and utter awe. We're talking about a city that's literally located in the middle of a lake. with waterways, with, fountains, with, paved roads. This is, this is something that was, to their eyes completely unbelievable since it was something that had never been seen in Europe. Same goes for Francisco Pizarro when he comes upon Atahualpa in the Inca Empire. In present day Peru, all the way through Chile, you are talking about an empire that is, has well over, 10,000 soldiers. You're talking about, a large plazas. You're talking about populations and cities of tens of thousands. So, this idea that this is, just, oh, a society that's just, random natives, that's just not the case. There's no way that any of these societies could have survived without, a suitable and enduring food source, without a military to protect themselves, without, adequate, water supplies, as well as a bureaucracy that's able to keep order. So, to make it sound like, this is just a bunch of natives on, on the coast, is just completely inaccurate. Okay. And so to compare, between, Europe and the Americas at this time is that it's very similar, right? You have populations that are booming. You have populations that are governed by various, kings and, monarchies. And so, but there are differences about what's happening in the Americas versus what's happening in Europe. Similar sizes in population, similar systems in terms of governance of an authority, right? That's derived from some sort of spiritual hierarchy, a god, whatever the case may be. But the motivations for Europeans to want to explore really builds off of what is happening prior, right? You have, a couple of aspects that are actually urging the need to move out. So one of the first is that the maximization of yields in terms of land, right? Europeans have become extremely efficient in terms of being able to maximize the amount of production that they can get out of the land, whether this is, in terms of the process of thirds, where, one section of the ground is left fallow, one is planted, one is actually producing, right? This allows the ground to be able to become naturally, revitalized so that they don't, overwork the land and are still able to produce. They're able to figure out how to maximize yields in smaller areas of the land, right? And they're also able to maximize, in terms of, the efficiency of the production, whether that is in the use of tools and technology or physical animal labor to help, plow the fields. But what is to be key is that most of the land is controlled by, one or two groups. We either have the church or we have the nobility. And remember that system of feudalism, while that is largely coming to an end, land is really controlled by a few. And with the need to be able to expand and the access and the resource to land, this is certainly a motivation to want to be able to, to move out because the resources on this land, right? Europe is pretty much exhausted with its resource. It has cut down, the majority of its forests. Its its streams, are polluted. Its harbors are polluted, right? They've outfished and out resourced everything, right? Pretty much they're at their, their peak here. So they need to be able to figure out and spread out and get more resources. They also have an expanding population, very similar to what's going on in the Americas. And they've already, explored and traded, right? We have improved ships developed by both the Portuguese and the Spanish. In terms of exploration, they've already circumnavigated around the Horn of Africa. They've made it to Asia. They've explored various areas, in Southeast Asia and Japan. And so now it is just a matter of, trying to figure out where exactly, people can get to, to try to figure out if there's additional resources. And the key with those resources, is really about, trying to get to the riches of India and Asia. Just to give you some background, the Ottoman Empire, which is located in present-day Turkey, that holds control pretty much from North Africa, the Middle East, and onward, has really blocked off this passage or has made it extremely difficult for Europeans and Christians in particular to be able to get to the riches of Asia. So they basically have cut off that route. So, Europeans are, of course, going around Africa all the way into Asia, as you can see in this map. But that journey can take a year, sometimes more, right? And so the idea is there another way to get there? Could we instead sail west instead of going east, right? And because of the questioning and the doctrine that is, simply being questioned in terms of that authority, people are like, well, is it possible to go another way? Well, let's see. If somebody's willing to back us in this endeavor, right? Raise the money, give us the ships, give us the resources, let's go ahead and try it. Okay. So, of course, that is exactly what spurs, Columbus to take this journey, right? He, goes to, the kingdoms of Spain. He goes to, people in Italy. He goes to people in France. Nobody's interested in it. Why? Well, they're just sort of like, well, it just seems a little bit, risky. It really wasn't that big of a risk in terms of the cost, especially if a king or a queen was going to back him, in this endeavor. But most people were just limited in terms of their knowledge and their authority, and awareness of, whether or not they were going to back this. But he does get the backing of, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. They had just, united, the Iberian Peninsula. They had kicked out the Moors. They had, kicked out the Jews. They had basically, solidified their control. And so, why not? Let's see what the heck is going on. So, they backed this guy. And, many of the explorers at this time, much like Columbus, they're interested in one thing, and that is more resources. We're looking at natural resources, particularly gold and silver, but lumber as well as anything that can be exploited. Why? Well, it's not just the need for land and resources, but there is this system that has developed in Europe, which is known as mercantilism. And this is a very simple idea, and it's one that strongly influences our capitalist ideology that we have with us today. It is that there is a limited amount of resources out there. And if I don't get to it first and control it and take it for myself, somebody else will get to it, control it, and then I will be at their mercy. Sound familiar? Right? Right? It's precisely what our president has been pushing in terms of the minerals in Greenland. It is precisely the ideas that he is pushing in terms of the oil in Venezuela, the oil in Iran, right? These are these notions, right? Mercantilism, which develops out of the feudal economies and eventually goes into this, minor developing, market economies in Europe during the, 14th and 15th centuries, develops into a mercantile idea, which that resources, because of where we are here in Europe, are limited. We need to go and get the other resources that are out there. Once we can secure those, we can secure our own power and authority, and therefore we can dominate other people. Okay, so this is what is one of the things that is pushing that idea to, go out there and explore. Get the resources that are in India, get the resources that are in Asia, bring them out back to Europe for our own benefit. Let's see what we can do. Okay, so important, just go ahead and take a look at the thoughts, of Christopher Columbus. If you can take a look at some of his recorded diary entries and the documentation that we have, it's pretty clear on how he's judging Native Americans, right? The mercantile attitude is very, very evident, right? He wants to see how he can use these people, use their resources, use their land, right? This is that, God and glory, yeah, it sounds good for the history books and it sounds good as a narrative. It's what we would call, hey, yeah, it makes good copy for, publicity. But the reality is that we're in this for the money, people. And so what can these people do for us? We're going to make some sort of justification to be able to use these individuals for whatever physical benefit that we can make to get ourselves, a better position in Europe. Okay. The key at this point, remember, is not to stay. Okay. We're here to use whatever resources we can get, take them back to Spain, take them back to Europe for our own benefit to be able to improve ourselves. And let's be very clear. The people that are going on these journeys and adventures, these aren't the best and the brightest of Europe, okay? Most of these people are, low end, they have some ambition, they have some knowledge, right? But most of these people are out of work, military individuals. Some of these people had criminal backgrounds. These are the low end people of society. Why are they going? Well, hell, they've got nothing to lose. And the majority of people that go out into these areas come back extremely wealthy, come back extremely prominent, right? Why? Because they're basically pillaging and looting any resources that they can get. Okay. Because the intentions of Columbus, as you can see in this quote right here, right, is that, they can be useful to us. He uses the term right there, good servants. Okay. Right. Servants, and intelligent. Okay. Let's be clear. They're not equals. Okay. Not equals. Okay. But, they can be easily made right, into people that can serve us and benefit us, right? This is the whole purpose, right? This isn't interest. These people aren't equals. We're not here to develop the society, right? We're here to, proselytize and, Christianize these heathens to bring them to the knowledge of God, right? So that we can justify and take their land and take any resources that we need, okay? But it is very important to understand what happens as a result of the meeting of these cultures. Okay. Isolation from each other, right, over long extended periods of time allows individuals to develop in their own ways and their own groups. Now, there's a couple of things that happen as a result of this interaction. We call this the Columbian Exchange, right? This is an exchange that takes place when humans who have not interacted with each other for literally, hundreds and thousands of years, right, have an interaction with each other. And each has developed various systems of government, various systems of food sources, various systems of survival, in terms of, surviving in their respective environments. And they meet for the first time. So, like I said before, they're not only exchanging ideas, language, cultures, customs, they're exchanging food, and of course, they are exchanging fluids. That can come in the form of, physical fluids in terms of sex. It can also come in the fluids of sneezing on each other and coughing on each other, the exchange of disease. Okay, so let's take a look at some of this exchange. What we're doing is we're talking about the exchange of food and animals, people, ideas, all of that. The Columbian Exchange. So let's take a look at this map. Okay, so what is coming from Europe, Central, East Asia, Africa to the area, to the Americas? Well, they are bringing coffee, sugar, apples, carrots, plums, right? All of the fruits that we associate, right? With European and Africa, as well as East Asia and the Middle East, right? We're bringing all those things. What's also that we're bringing is all of these large animals, right? We call them the big five. So you're talking about cattle, sheep, horses, goats, right? And what the heck is the other one? I always forget the last one. Pigs, sheep, cattle. So that's like cows, bulls, horses, and goats. I think that's it. I think those are the big five, right? So they've got these big five. Why is that important? Okay, so when Europeans bring horses, right? When they bring pigs, when they bring, lambs and, cattle and everything else, all of that fauna in the Americas, they don't have any of that. They don't have horses, right? They don't have any sort of, cattle or cows or, sheep or anything like that. Okay. And this is kind of important. Why? Because all of that big megafauna that, used to be in the Americas died out during the Ice Age. They do have animals, right? There's bison and there's buffalo and they have bears and all sorts of things, right? And there's jaguars and everything else, but they don't have anything that they can ride, right? They don't have horses, so they don't have transportation that can get them from one area to the next, right? they don't have any, big animals that can help pull a plow or anything else like that. What they do have in South America is they have the llama, okay? But a llama, you can't ride it. It can't pull anything for you. It's not very good for that. It is good for one thing, is the wool. The wool is much better than the wool that's produced by sheep in Europe at the time. It's much more durable, it lasts a lot longer, and it keeps you a lot warmer, okay, than traditional wool like they have in Europe, okay? But so when gets introduced, like for instance the horse which gets introduced or the pig that gets introduced, right? These animals, literally the Europeans are bringing them and they just sort of just let them go, right? They have some, but some escape and they begin to have the wild horses again that reestablish themselves, especially in North America. We call them Mustangs today. Okay, so these horses, that then begin to be used by native peoples, change their fundamental way of life. They're able to hunt, right? They can chase after buffalo, chase after big game, right? They can, move quicker into various regions, right? The pig fundamentally changes, the regions. Why? Because of two things. One, it provides a new food source for native peoples as well as Europeans, because what is it that pigs do? Well, pigs just take care of themselves, right? They just eat whatever's around, right? And they just sort of manage themselves. And then when you're hungry, you go out and slaughter one. There you go. Bacon for everyone. But here's another thing that they, do that's kind of annoying is they destroy everything, particularly the native crops that, the Native Americans, had developed at the time at the arrival of Europeans. Crucial to know this, that because there's no big megafauna that to destroy your crops, Native Americans plant crops without the need to fence things in, right? Because they don't need to worry about animals coming to destroy them. Well, when Europeans bring their horses and especially their pigs, these pigs just destroy all their crops. And what type of crops are Native Americans producing? Well, the most famous, of course, is going to be corn. Corn actually comes from a grass called the Seosinte grass. It's like a little spindly piece of grass, right? But how does it turn into this massive piece of corn? Well, corn is not a gift from the gods, okay? It's actually a consequence of genetic alteration that native peoples developed literally over hundreds of years to turn it into something nourishing that you could actually eat. Okay, so corn is one of them. Chocolate is another. Tomatoes are another. Chili peppers, peanuts, right? We're talking about squash, all the different types of beans, right? Rubber is found in South America, right? All of the different types of fruit that exist. Pineapple, guavas, cranberries, right? Pumpkins, avocados, right? All these things, right? That we have. So this is the exchange that happens in terms of the food stuff, in terms of the animal stuffs. But let's also talk about diseases, right? Europeans are bringing measles, right? They had developed, pretty decent resistance to this over the thousands of years that it had been in Europe, but native peoples don't have any sort of resistance to this at all. So measles is absolutely devastating. One of the reasons why it is so devastating is because measles has the ability to linger in the air. It not only can linger in the air for several hours, maybe even a day, but it can also linger on clothing, right? Like a blanket. So literally somebody who had measles and it's on a blanket and that blanket gets passed on to various people, here it's just being passed around. This is one of the reasons why disease in the Americas actually beats many explorers before they even get there. And we have documentation from many Europeans when they would come upon, entire cities or villages that are just completely absent of people. Why? They're dead. Because disease moves a lot quicker than people do. And so when this idea of a pristine wilderness actually comes up, well, there's actually some truth to that. Why? Because all the people are dead. It's not because there weren't any people there. It wasn't because the people, just decided that, what, well, hey, we're just going to, say goodbye to our societies. It's because they were killed off. Because as soon as Columbus stepped off, that boat and brought with him disease, including the rats that were on the ship themselves that had been introduced to this population, this is what ends up happening. So the exchange is absolutely devastating. Okay. Now, to be clear, okay, as soon as new lands are discovered, of course, people are going to start to lay claims to it. And of course, the two groups that lay claims to this are going to be Spain and Portugal. Fascinating how they left everybody else out. It's called the Treaty of Tordesillas. And so this fascinating thing is that you had a pope, right, who grants Portugal the right to all the land that's south of the Cape Verde Islands. Cape Verde is off of the coast of North Africa. And, says that, yeah, basically this, belongs to Portugal and not Spain. And then what ends up happening is that in 1490s, after the discovery of the Americas, there's a new pope. His name is Alex the Sixth, and he's Spanish born. Just just to let you know that there's no way that kid he could be biased towards any sort of group, right? And so he decides that Spain has the ability to claim over all of this that Portugal had. And guess what? There's going to be this, this idea that anything that, they had before, that the previous pope had before, completely null and void. Here we go. So, of course, to avoid war, there's the Treaty of Tordesillas, and then you should actually take a look at that, click on the link. But here's the idea that I want you guys to be reinforced with. When we're talking about claiming lands, right? Who has the right? Who has the freedom to do that? Notice whom exactly they are considering and who is not considered in this, right? We're not talking about the 60 million or so people that are located in the Americas, right? We're just talking about the two European countries that are going to make this decision, right? Remember, there are other Europeans, there are other people who are interested in this area, but of course, that's not what's going to happen. And it's kind of crucial because we want to actually think about the influence that Spain, Spanish people in particular, and Portugal have over the new territories in the Americas, okay? Because of the conquistadors. Now, here are four people. There are many others, but these are ones that usually pique the most interest because what they did or how many people they slaughtered, right, as a result of their adventures, into various areas. So you've got Cortez, you've got Pizarro, you've got Hernando de Soto, right? You've heard of the myths, of looking for the fountain of youth and all this other nonsense, right? Please don't use Disney as a moniker for, historical facts. Okay. It's all entertainment. And then of course you've got Coronado. So, take a look at these individuals, right? But the key with any of these individuals, whether it's Cortez, whether it's Pizarro, whether it's anything, you can take a look and see what they did. But what I want you guys to really be able to understand is how these interactions with these various groups are already creating conflicts and are creating distinct identities, right? Areas of difference, right? Being able to separate oneself and identify the other, right? For purposes of a mercantile attitude to be able to justify the repression, oppression, destruction, slaughter, annihilation of an entire group of people. So whether that's Cortez, Pizarro, De Soto, right? The thing that I want you to understand is that as the Spanish were going through their process of conquering and going through their process of, its complete annihilation, is that there are systems that are going to be developing in these early colonial outposts that take hold and will have repercussions in terms of this idea of rights and freedoms, right? What I am talking about is in particular known as the encomienda system, okay? This is a labor system that was established by the Spanish crown as a way to justify the authority of various Europeans in terms of the large tracts of land that they would control and whom would do the work and the labor and what labor they could do based on their race. And I'm going to use this term broadly speaking, okay, because it's really just tied to their ethnic connection to Spanish blood and where they are in this caste system. Okay. So, very interesting to know is that the social system, as you can see in this image here, right? Notice how each is determined based off of color, clothing, and then the job that they would be doing. Okay. This is the encomienda system, this caste system. Okay. Caste system in terms of what you could do in society in these early colonial areas in the Americas was based off of birth. We will begin to understand the system of slavery that develops as a result, right, legally, which will be eventually tied to birth. At this point, we have a system where birth determines what you could do in society as the amount of Spanish relation of blood that you had. So, what's interesting about this is that you can go to various museums and you can actually see these examples. So I'll actually play this one for you. This is in the National Anthropology Museum in Mexico City. And so this is a video that I took. That's the picture of it there on the right. But here in Mexico, what they did was with this map is that, as you can see, they define every specific group, region based off of color, based off of labor, based off of clothing. And this was how they were able to define who was what and what people could do based off of how they were tied to Spanish blood. And what we're talking about is this, okay? At the top of this caste system, you have the peninsulares. These are people who were born in Spain, right? Born in Spain, they're now here in the Americas. These are the people at the top. They're the ones that own the tracts of land. They were granted this little space by the king, right? Peninsulares. Then underneath them, you have the Criollos. These are the people who were born in the Americas but are of Spanish blood, right? They have two Spanish parents, okay? But they're not born in Spain. They're born in the Americas, okay? So they are technically a colonial, okay? But they tracked their ancestry to Spanish blood. Underneath them, you had two other groups. You had the mestizos and the mulattoes. The mestizos are a group that is Spanish ancestry that is mixed with Native Americans, and then mulattoes are Spanish ancestry mixed with Black African slaves. Okay? You see the difference? Okay? So, some degree of Spanish blood mixed with either a native or imported slaves from Africa into the colonial system. Then underneath them, you have people who are of pure native ancestry and pure Black African ancestry. Okay? Lowest on the totem pole. So this basically gave you a determination as to what exactly you could and could not do. Now, the interesting thing about mestizos and mulattoes is that this was even a degree, right? Because it's a degree of how much European blood, how much African blood, how much Indian blood. And that's the reason why in this video, you have all of these different areas. So you see, let me pause that right there. See there up at the top? Those are the Peninsulares. That's the Europeans, or those are the Creoles, right? Right there. Then, as you can see like, okay, look at how they change right here, right? So we're seeing various degrees of these mulattoes, right? Various degrees of the mestizos. Now, these people could also be Creoles as well. But chances are, as you look at this video, right? And let me see if I can fast forward to various groups. And so what we're looking for is we're looking like clearly, oops, darn. Going too far. Pause right there. Okay. So you can see like the degree of here, like clearly more native, right? This looks much more like a mestizo, like in terms of what exactly the traditions, the work that they're doing, right? Where they're located. Like you can clearly see, look, this looks much more Creole, right? Still European, still of a higher standard than these individuals right here who are living out in the areas. It's also very clear to look at the background. Notice the grass hut. Notice, this clearly looks like a balcony, looks like a larger house of some sort, right? Because how close you were to Spanish blood also determined usually your wealth, your money, your job, right? What you did in society. Now, this, of course, is what is going to carry over and be borrowed, right, for the systems that are going to develop in North America as well. Okay. So to understand that sort of contact and that relationship, right, we are already determining outcomes based off of cultural, racial, a developing idea of race, right, a developing of difference, right, based off of how much Spanish blood, right? Which we know to be, how does one determine that? As you can see, all of those different images, this is completely, what you would consider, no, none of these groups are homogenous, right? It's very, very difficult to be able to determine. It's like, well, how do you determine this? And this is very ad hoc, right? It's like, well, they look like it, they appear it, they behave this way, right? This is very, very difficult because we know that culture is very fluid, right? We know that behavior is very fluid. We know that people learn and borrow and try different things. And so, this is where these systems, right, and this idea of freedom, the idea of who can do what and with what and when, right? All of these things are going to become calling into question this idea of freedom. Because when we talk about the idea of human rights, when we talk about the idea of civil rights, we have to be able to understand where exactly did these inequities start? And they start here with the initial contact and the development and establishment of various systems, namely the encomienda system and the caste system in the Americas. Okay. Um, Not gonna really good. Let's just, so really, I just want you guys to understand the legacy of that, right? Labor systems, cultural decimation, as well as the motivations, right? Because this is what's going to get into all those ideas in terms of what exactly does it mean to be free, to have choice, to be able to make decisions independently, right? What position do you have to hold in society in order to be able to assert one's individual will, right? Is it really going to be somebody, at the low end of this caste system, right? Or is it going to be somebody at the top? And so that's what we're going to be looking at. So if you have any questions or anything like that, feel free to reach out.